When Uncharted 4: A Thief's End was first revealed during E3 2014, Naughty Dog presented this trailer featuring Nathan Drake waking on a beach, running at 60 frames per second. As we know now, however, the final game would actually ship at 30 frames per second instead. Considering the visual quality, of course, this was acceptable given the hardware, but we've long been left wondering what could have been. Well, today we finally have our answer. It's now possible to play Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy at not just 60 frames per second, but also 120 frames per second on PlayStation 5 thanks to the Legacy of Thieves collection. Yet, we've seen other first-party titles receive updates, including Naughty Dog's own The Last of Us Part 2, bumping the frame rates up to 60 already. So the big question here is, what else does this new collection offer over and above frame rate? That's exactly what we'll be discussing in today's video. We'll examine the performance across each mode, the image quality, and of course the visual changes that I've uncovered, in addition to discussing other key enhancements made possible in this version of the game. So, with that in mind, let's get into it. Uncharted 4's arrival on PlayStation 4 in 2016 was a big deal. It was Naughty Dog's first game targeting PS4 class hardware, and it brought along with it a whole slew of new rendering features. Uncharted 4 was also an impressively executed game that basically perfects the cinematic action the series had become known for, with a huge range of locations and set pieces. It's been a while since I've sat down to play it, but I was immediately reminded why it was so special in the first place. Naughty Dog is truly the master of balancing player agency within a tightly cinematic experience. Then, a year later, Naughty Dog followed this up with Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, a standalone game featuring Chloe and Nadine on a new adventure. Now, both of these adventures have been combined into a single release on PlayStation 5, but it is worth noting that this is just the single-player portion, not the multiplayer. But honestly, that's the main draw in the first place. So, these games are solid, but the big question I had going into this project of course revolves around the visuals themselves. The trailers never really made it clear that there would be any changes or improvements to the core visuals beyond resolution and frame rate. After examining the game, however, I can confirm that there are at least some visual improvements and changes to the presentation, and we'll discuss those momentarily. But first, let's establish the three modes available in each game. Essentially, you now have access to a Fidelity mode, a Performance mode, and the Performance Plus mode from the options menu. You can change these options at any time during gameplay without rebooting the game. So firstly, the Fidelity mode, which renders at a fixed 3840 by 2160 resolution with a target frame rate of 30 frames per second. Predictably, this is the sharpest mode. The second option then is Performance. This delivers a resolution of 1440p while targeting 60 frames per second. Compared to the 4K mode, the difference is perhaps less significant than you might expect, owing to the heavy reliance on post-processing effects such as depth of field. 1440p is the same resolution as that used on PS4 Pro, though the Pro targets 30 frames per second. Lastly then, there's the Performance Plus mode. This is limited to just 1080p, but operates at 120 frames per second instead. Now, despite the loss in detail when using this mode, I enjoyed Performance Plus the most, as the bump to 120Hz is extremely satisfying, but obviously, as we've seen in many other games now, hitting this type of frame rate does not come cheap. All three of these display options have their uses, I'd suggest, but the one disappointment here lies in the lack of dynamic resolution scaling. This is something we've yet to see in a Naughty Dog game, and it has a direct impact on the selected rendering resolution. I believe that PS5 could conceivably handle resolutions above 1080p or 1440p in their respective modes, but maybe not in all situations. Thus, in order to maximize fluidity without dynamic resolution scaling, they basically had to clamp down and select one of the two targets. That said, the target of 1080p for the 120Hz mode kinda works for more people in the sense that there are many more displays that support 120Hz at just 1080p as opposed to HDMI 2.1 displays that can do 4K and 120Hz. So even if you're not running the latest display, there's a good chance you can still enjoy this mode. Fortunately, even at 1080p, the game's anti-aliasing does a great job of keeping the image somewhat clean and soft. It looks very filmic, if you will, which kinda makes sense considering the game's ambitions. But what about the visuals themselves? This is still a very handsome game, especially considering the time of its release. I love the pre-calculated approach to global illumination. The bounce light, especially in Madagascar, is beautifully realized. Plus, there's just an absurd attention to detail everywhere you look, with some truly ambitious set-piece sequences and amazing materials work throughout. But what do you get in this new version specifically? Well, the changes on PlayStation 5 are admittedly rather subtle, but they are certainly welcome, and I'd like to highlight them now for those curious. Firstly, the most significant change lies in the increase in LOD distance. In many of the game's outdoor scenes, you'll see things such as plants drawn much further out into the distance. There's basically more detail during many of these sections in the game, and this applies to all modes too, even the 120Hz mode. So you'll basically see less visible pop-in and improved overall detail levels, which is nice. How about a couple more examples of the LOD differences? For instance, here at the beginning of the heist mission, the rock formation exhibits more detail over on the PS5 version. But this is of the more subtle variety. A bigger difference can be observed in this next scene. If we pause it for a moment, check out the buildings here in the distance. On PS4 Pro from this distance, most of the buildings are lacking a lot of detail. The detail draws in as you approach them, but on PS5 you can see most of that detail even from a distance. Over on the left then, we see things like distant trees have been improved on PS5. The flat billboards of the PS4 Pro have been replaced with more full shadowed trees instead. Secondly, there's a change in overall brightness and contrast that is slightly mystifying to me. Basically, it seems like the game has stronger contrast on PlayStation 5. It might be related to how the system handles SDR content, but it's not entirely clear. But due to the way it selectively impacts certain aspects of the image, I'm not sure this is the case. It really feels like some changes have been made here, and it results in a slightly punchier looking game. There's also subtle changes to the way specific things are shaded, like this grenade here on Drake's belt. This same scene also demonstrates a difference in overall texture clarity. By and large, most of the game's textures seem to be completely the same throughout, but I did notice instances where PS5 exhibited more detail. This could be tied to slower texture loading in some instances, but in others you'll never even see the higher detail texture pop into existence. Like this scene for instance, the texture is noticeably sharper on PlayStation 5. But even if it were tied to texture streaming, you never actually see a higher quality texture appear at all on PlayStation 4. So what this means is that many of these scenes just end up looking sharper in the new version as a result. There's also more subtle things, like in this scene, there's visible changes to the reflection, as well as subtle shading differences in the grass. Or here, where the shadows on Drake's face exhibit more noise and artifacts on PS4 Pro, while the PS5 version appears much cleaner in comparison. Worth noting that all of the comparison shots I've been showing were captured in the PS5's performance mode, which means it's the same rendering resolution as PS4 Pro. But if I can bring in the 4K 30 mode for a moment, we can actually compare the motion blur shutter speed, and this is something that has changed, at least in some instances. The camera rotation blur, for instance, has been dialed down significantly. When comparing these two, you can see that the blur is far more exaggerated on PS4. Personally, I'd love an option to restore the full length of the blur trails on PS5, but in this case, I suspect most of the audience will prefer the new implementation, and that's fine. But there's more to it than this. The actual quality of the blur seems to have been slightly improved, with less visible artifacting compared to the original. Unfortunately, the motion blur doesn't seem to scale as well as I'd like when using the higher frame rate modes. Essentially, shutter speed seems unchanged in the 60 frames per second mode, but with the doubling of the frame rate, the effect becomes less visible. But I think it'll work well for most people, and it still accentuates the animation nicely. The real issue is when using the 120Hz mode. In fact, at first it almost appeared as if motion blur was completely disabled, but if you freeze some of the more extreme shots, you can still see that the image is blurring out somewhat. But you basically lose the entire cinematic effect of it. Now, the game still looks really good in motion due to the ultra high frame rate, but it could look better with improved motion blur when using this mode. But of course, if you're one of those heathens that just can't stand motion blur at all, and I know who you are, there is a slider in the options menu to turn everything down if you like. Still, I think in this case, most people will actually like the new implementation and likely not want to dial it down because it really accentuates the game's animation work. It should also be noted that The Lost Legacy exhibits all the same changes I mentioned in regards to Uncharted 4 itself. The same LOD improvements are even more noticeable, in fact, due to the proliferation of vast vegetation-filled environments. There's less pop-in throughout as a result of these changes, but aside from that and other tweaks, it honestly looks very similar. Another major feature, though, are the fast loading times. Okay, so if you play the game straight through, everything is mostly seamless, even on a PS4. The game basically streams as you play, so you won't run into loading screens outside of pressing continue. But if you wanted to use the chapter or encounter selection menus, it was a serious problem. Case in point, let's say you wanted to replay one of the game's battles. You go through the menu, select it, and wait. There's a rather beefy loading screen before you actually get into the action. When you finish the battle, then, you get this rather abrupt menu option, allowing you to either retry or go back to the main menu. And returning to the main menu has a shorter loading time associated with it, but it's still there. Essentially, getting in and out of battles is tedious to the point of making this feature basically unusable. That's no longer the case on PlayStation 5. Everything is loaded in an instant. The game simply fades to black, then fades back up. This suddenly makes it possible to replay scenes you enjoyed in the game without constantly bumping into loading screens. The key thing here is that super fast loading is only made possible as a result of this being a native PS5 app. That's not to say you don't get a benefit when running the game in backwards compatibility mode, but if we quickly run a test on that, installing the PS4 version to PS5, you can see that the loading is just a little bit faster than it was on an actual PS4 Pro. We basically shave it down from 48 seconds on Pro to 32 seconds on PS5, which is much slower than the less than 3 seconds we get with the native PS5 version. But what about the actual performance, the frame rate? So again, the original target on PS4 and PS4 Pro is 30 frames per second, and it was very stable on PS4, but when it received an update for PS4 Pro, that version didn't quite manage to reach the target in the busiest scenes. Don't get me wrong, it's still a mostly stable 30 frames per second, but larger action sequences would often see dips in frame rate that did detract slightly from the overall presentation, usually dips between 24 to 27 frames per second. Momentary to be sure, but still noticeable. So how does the PlayStation 5 version fare? Well, with 3 modes to test, there's a lot to go through, so let's check it out. Firstly, the fidelity mode. Running at 30 FPS, it is, as expected, basically flawless, at least as far as I've tested. Not even one single dropped frame was detected when playing in this mode. Honestly, this comes as no surprise, and I'd be curious to see what the frame rate is like if the 30 FPS cap were removed, because it does suggest plenty of headroom. Which leads me to another point. There's a big missed opportunity here to support 40 frames per second at 120Hz output like Ratchet & Clank A Rift Apart. You see, at 40 FPS, each frame must be drawn in around 25 milliseconds, which is partway between 30 and 60 FPS, which have a 16 or 33 millisecond interval, so it's a perfect halfway point, which makes it awesome specifically for 120Hz displays, where it can be displayed with even frame cadence. We'd really like to see more developers using this mode. Then of course there's the performance mode, which targets 60 frames per second at 1440p. Much like the fidelity option, the frame rate target is reached basically all the time. Any blips that do occur tend to be limited to just a single frame here or there, nothing major. The main scene I wanted to test though is the vehicle battle in Madagascar, as this is one of the heavier sequences in the game and an example where PS4 Pro often drops frames. This new version simply doesn't have any trouble at all during the entire sequence. So, thus far, we have near flawless performance in these two modes, but of course, the most challenging mode here is going to be Performance Plus, which targets 120 frames per second instead. So how does that fare? Well, this is the one mode that does actually exhibit some drops, but it's important to stress that most of the game plays without issue. Most sequences in the game are locked to 120 frames per second, or at worst drop a few frames here or there that are nearly invisible due to the high overall count of frames. This is how I played most of the game, and what you're seeing here is representative of the experience in general. But I did find a handful of specific sequences which did exhibit drops. Unsurprisingly, the Madagascar chase is one of the main offenders. During the initial drive through the city, I did note a few drops here and there, nothing significant, but more so than many other locations. It's a big environment with a lot of detail, so it kinda made sense. And in fact, this level of performance basically continued up through the sequence where Nate latches onto the moving convoy. However, once we actually reach the vehicle battle, the scene where PS4 Pro dropped the most, the target begins to falter with drops like this. I think the mix of vegetation with shadows being drawn into the smoke particles is causing a lot of GPU related spikes here. But it is worth stressing that with a frame rate this high, the drops are a lot more difficult to actually feel in practice. But it is clear that these scenes are just a little too heavy for PlayStation 5. When targeting 120 FPS of course. Another scene that stuck out to me is the drawbridge battle. I'm not entirely sure where the bottleneck is here to be honest, but it's the first major scene that I noticed where frames were dropping at all in the 120Hz mode. As you can see, the performance is not perfect and it's a weirdly heavy scene. However, again, as I mentioned, most other sequences do run without a hitch, which is why I would say by and large, I actually really recommend giving this mode a shot. The main benefit here, beyond the extra visual fluidity, is that the game winds up feeling extra responsive in a way that no prior Uncharted game ever has. If you found yourself struggling with aiming, especially back on PS4, I think you'd be surprised at how much easier and fun it is to pull off shots at 120Hz. It's a great example of why high frame rates and low frame times are so useful for gameplay. Pretty much everything I've said here also applies to The Lost Legacy. Specifically, the fidelity and performance modes both hit their intended target frame rates pretty much all the time. These two modes are basically about as perfect as you can get, I should say. But The Lost Legacy is an interesting one because it presents much larger environments than anything we typically saw in Uncharted 4. And this does have somewhat of an impact on the 120Hz mode. Now, it's still very stable overall, but while simply driving around the world, I did note some dips kinda like this, especially when moving between one area to the next. But of course, keep in mind that the frame rate is still typically over 100 frames a second, so these dips are a lot less noticeable than they would be if the target were lower, but it is something worth noting. But unfortunately, it did raise one issue. I wasn't able to test out a later train sequence in the game, and that ties into the save transfer function. So basically, normally you're supposed to be able to load your PS4 saves directly from the main menu, and this actually worked great in Uncharted 4. It allowed me to instantly load up my completed save from PS4. With The Lost Legacy, however, despite also having a completed save, the PS5 version refused to detect those saves. Maybe a region mismatch? It's not entirely clear, but there we go. Okay, so there's two additional features I'd like to discuss here. 3D audio support and DualSense features. Firstly, the audio. For the most part, I prefer playing my games using a home theater setup, and these two games have always featured an exceptionally high quality sound mix that takes full advantage of surround and subwoofer channels. On PS5, the new 3D audio features, however, are designed for headphone users, or to a degree, TV speaker users. The idea is to bring the surround sound experience you get with a full surround sound setup to an audience that doesn't have access to the equipment. So how effective is it? Well, I plugged in my venerable Sennheiser HD595 headphones. They're more than 15 years old at this point, but they sound amazing and are in great condition. You can see me wearing them in DF Direct Weekly. So, Uncharted's support for 3D audio and headphones is pretty impressive, I have to admit. Lower frequencies manage to shine through, and there is a genuine sense of 3D space within the sound mix. The introduction sequence for Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, for instance, is one of the best examples. The sounds of war echoing across in the background contrasts beautifully against near-field audio. The marketplace shootout is another great sequence. The sound of gunfire and objects shattering around the player actually works well. Or the scene on the beach where Nate wakes up in a rainstorm. The three-dimensional soundscape created by the rain is powerful and effective. Essentially, they've managed to translate the original sound mix to headphones, and it works. The game wasn't really designed for this feature either, so it's a nice example of how it can be effectively adapted. It doesn't quite match an actual home theater setup, mind you, but it's good. The DualSense functions then are perhaps less exciting. Trigger pulls now feel slightly more convincing, and the sensation of carnage can be felt within the pad itself. I'll admit, what sold me most on these features is the PS4 version. I was switching back and forth between the PS4 and PS5 versions while capturing footage for this video. Going back to that last gen version, it was clear to me that the DualSense implementation on PS5 did in fact have a positive impact on the game. It's certainly nothing game-changing, mind you, but it's good. Even simple things like tapping up and down in the menu now have an associated and satisfying response. A nice touch. So that's the Uncharted Legacy of Thieves collection. Hopefully this has been a good summary of what you can expect. I remain a huge fan of both of these games, and this is now the best way to experience them. The improvements in controller response and visual quality are very welcome, while other features such as fast loading complement the package nicely. This also means that if you're a collector of physical media, we now have a complete version of both of these games, fully patched up and enhanced, available on disc. It's basically an archive version of Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy. It's almost like buying a deluxe 4K UHD Blu-ray version of a movie that you already had on normal Blu-ray. But even more effective, really, given the technical improvements. And of course, there is an upgrade option for $10. It's not a free update a la The Last of Us Part 2, but at least this is a proper native PS5 release with all that entails. But with that, we've arrived at the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let us know. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and check us out over on Twitter. That's all from me though. Thanks for watching.